because, as she so clearly said towards the end, she's raised lots more problems than solutions, and our community is tasked with trying to bring those solutions into being. And yet there are problems with the solutions that we're proposing. First of all, many of our solutions arise very regionally and independent of each other. And yet, in order to talk to each other, we have to be able to come together. And logistically, that is a challenge because our infrastructures are primarily funded at the national or even local levels. And there's very little funding for travel for us to engage with each other to talk about this. And as I think has been pointed out many times, our solutions need to take advantage of these interdisciplinary perspectives. And I would add in that interdisciplinarity, sociology and history of science as well. And we just don't have the ability to sustain that very easily. And so what I'll be talking about today is our effort to try to bring people together through a new community of practice that builds on our previous interest group on agricultural data, which has been organized through the Research Data Alliance. So I'll first introduce the Research Data Alliance, which many of you may already be aware of. We'll talk a little bit about what we've done previously to foster global coordination of these infrastructure efforts. And then we'll discuss our transition to a new social structure, essentially a community of practice within RDA, and what the opportunities are for that community of practice. And so I'll end with some conclusions, but we're really looking forward to the discussion that we're having, especially as I'm now recognizing that in addition to our solutions being regional and difficult to scale globally, our framing of the problems are also very regional and or disciplinary specific. So what is the Research Data Alliance? It was launched in 2013 through efforts of the European Commission, the United States, and Australia. And the goal is to enable this worldwide community to come together to build that social and technical infrastructure towards enabling open sharing and reuse of data, and in particular research data. And currently there are over 10,000 people involved in RDA from 145 countries, so it's become a quite large and widespread organization. And essentially it provides a neutral space where its members can come together to discuss, develop, and adopt infrastructure to promote data sharing and data-driven research. Now, the interest group in agricultural data has formed within that RDA structure. And I'm showing here a couple of websites. One is the RDA website, where our charter exists and where some of the organizational details are shared, as well as the AIMS website, which has a bit more detail about our activities. That's sponsored by the FAO at the United Nations. So we have been working together to bring together membership, not just from Europe and Australia and the US, the sort of founding parts of the Research Data Alliance, but also to bring in memberships from the Americas and Africa and Asia, so that we can really try to reach those global practitioners. In order to do that, we have participated both in the Research Data Alliance plenary meetings, which happen twice a year, but for most of these plenary meetings, we have also organized a pre-meeting, which typically has consisted of 1 or 2 days of dedicated time to our agricultural interest group that can include historically up to about 80 to 100 different people from these communities in these different parts of the world. With the recent pandemic, we realized that we could shift to another logistical format, and we have organized both a webinar series and week-long sessions that actually attracted a record number of participants. Up to 350 people were at our week-long session last year associated with Plenary 15. Now, participation, actually, first let me talk a little bit about what we've learned from our prior work. So Under the umbrella of the interest group, there have been a number of working groups, including agri-semantics, wheat and rice data interoperability, some capacity building, etc. And what we've noticed is that the wheat data interoperability work was particularly successful because it involved vital communities that actually pre-existed the working group. And that has been a challenge for other working groups such as rice data, where those communities may not have been as solid, and therefore it was hard to sustain that working group. We've also noticed that RDA has allowed us to promote collaborating between our agricultural working groups with other working groups within RDA, and that also allows us to consider adapting outcomes from some of those other communities for our agricultural working groups, and therefore avoid reinventing the wheel. So to that point, RDA has been a very useful venue for us to become exposed to those other communities. However, we've also noticed that we've had much different levels of engagement depending on the institutions involved and their interests. It's been a big effort on our part to bring the Global South to our conversations, but especially when thinking about the more traditional plenary formats that RDA promotes, it's difficult logistically to bring those folks, particularly because of travel costs, to those plenary meetings during the time periods that they're scheduled, which often tend to favor the global north. So we do feel that we have key stakeholders already engaged in EGAD, but there's still a lot to do to promote our outputs and to engage with more of the organizations at the regional or national levels. So this is just a photo of some of the previous meetings that we've had to illustrate that they've ranged from somewhat small working groups to at times very large. And again, these have been associated both with the core plenary meetings, but also largely outside of those meetings with touch points back to the central RDA meetings. We have published our presentations on F1000 so that they're accessible to folks who were not necessarily able to participate in the meetings. So recently, we have been working with the Research Data Alliance to develop a fourth type of grouping within RDA. So the existing three groups were birds of a feather groups, which are very short-term pop-up opportunities to tackle emerging questions. Interest groups, which are more for discussion, and working groups, which are time-limited and have requirements for specific deliverables. So this fourth type of classification is a formal community of practice. And in particular, these would have a disciplinary or domain-specific focus rather than, say, a technology-specific focus. And they would need to be representative of those disciplines, and so involve recognized institutions or organizations that are characteristic of those disciplines. There needs to be a critical mass of group membership. So essentially, this is a maturation of those interest groups. We need to ensure that a community of practice has international membership with at least 10 countries. And in order to have a successful proposal, we will need to provide letters of support that indicate that the community of practice would be of value. And finally, the proposal should indicate that this community has already had experience creating a working group that is successful and provided some actual endorsed recommendations. So in our transition to a community of practice, we see EGAD as becoming the focal point for that discipline, for agriculture within RDA. And this is a natural role for our community because we've already developed this profile over the years. We're already networking with other communities of practice, both within RDA, but also, and even more importantly, outside of RDA. And we have adopted already an inclusive policy, and we'll continue to promote that to ensure that the Global South is represented in RDA. So what are the opportunities? I'm going to go through four particular areas, and because of time, I won't be able to go into each of these very deeply. Some of them will be familiar to you. You've already heard a little bit about some of them, and these are continuing topics of discussion. So the first one is about farmer research data governance. And I think that's come up many times already. And in particular, I'm going to be pointing to some efforts that we've had in the United States recently on this. And again, the problem is not new. We know that business owners in agriculture would benefit from sharing their data with researchers, but they need protections and assurances. And while there may be a number of regional frameworks for this, there's no established, consistent guidelines globally for this. And so we held a workshop in the United States last year, particularly in the context of big data and Internet of Things, and heard from a number of folks who are working in the United States primarily to discuss their thoughts on both technological and legal frameworks that could be useful in this context. And so I'm just going to bring forward a few highlights from that workshop and point you to a special issue that will have full papers on each of the talks, and that will be coming out in the Agronomy Journal later this year. We heard of a number of different ideas to expand FAIR data to either include S to ensure security and trust, or from Kevin Silverstein, adding ethical and reproducible to FAIR to make it fairer. We heard of a number of technological solutions such as blockchain or making data management plans electronic so that they could be examined and easily matched up with the results of the data management to make sure that the data are truly being made available as they were promised. And then a technical solution from ALT was to ensure that the code that might be working with the data is actually being used where the data exists so that the owner of that data can verify that nothing bad happened during the analysis of that code. So essentially keeping the control with the data owners. And finally, I'll just highlight a talk by Frederick that had to do with tribal nations perspectives over data sovereignty, and some examples I would point to included some data about wild rice and particular tribal mechanisms for providing access to that data. And just to share that the experiences in this context were that researchers who wanted access to the data had to essentially make their case that they were providing value back to the tribe about the use of the data. And the good news is that in almost every case, those requests were granted. And the only case where it wasn't was where it was clear that the use of the data was for personal gain on the part of the researcher and not so much for the First Nation that actually owned the data. So along those lines, the next topic I will turn to are the CARE Indigenous Data Governance Principles, which we've heard from about already, and just a reminder that the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, have been a big focus of attention since 2016 when they were articulated in the paper I've linked to here. And these new CARE principles, which were articulated primarily through efforts through the Research Data Archive, but clearly are building on quite a history of other efforts. The contrast is that those FAIR data principles, I think, as Courtney pointed out, are very data focused. It really has to do with the nature of the data and the data systems that those data are being made available in. Whereas the CARE principles, building on those more legal and social frameworks, are people and purpose focused rather than data focused. And the idea here is that these two can work together. And you can get more information, obviously, about this from the website down below. But I also want to point out that an example of the power of regional networks and their examination of principles like this and their planning and strategic thoughtfulness about how to implement is given here as an example from ESIP. ESIP is the Earth Science Information Partners. This is a United States organization that includes a lot of governmental organizations as well as more university and nonprofit organizations. And within ESIP, the Sustainable Data Management Cluster has been examining CARE very deeply in order to figure out how to operationalize these principles from the perspective of the infrastructure, the repositories that are actually serving data. And so that regional perspective of the repositories is something that could be brought to the EGAD community of practice and shared so that it can be considered and potentially customized and or changed through the conversation with the global community. I'd like to tell a little bit of story here because my thinking when I think about fair and care goes back to something that happened in the United States back in the days of disability rights. So when we passed the ADA legislation to provide requirements to support the disabled community with things like ramps into government office buildings, it became very clear to some human-computer interaction practitioners that the on-ramps, for example, to buildings that made them accessible to folks in wheelchairs were also the same ramps that could help everybody. For example, when you're carrying a wheeled luggage cart into a building, those ramps are extremely useful. So I just want to note that I see so much parallel between these principles that have been developed with stakeholder participation for Indigenous rights to the idea that these are actually human rights and that these will be much more broadly applicable beyond the Indigenous communities. Okay, I wanted to say just a little bit about plant data linkages, in particular in the taxonomic context. And I know we have people on this call who are very familiar with this. Elizabeth Arnaud in 2016 led a group that did a report on biodiversity data in the Global Biodiversity Information Facility and Fitness for Use for Agrobiodiversity. And the Taxonomic Databases Working Group, or Biodiversity Information Standards, has had a few symposia on agricultural data. And in particular, I'm calling out some work by my colleagues from India who have talked about the importance of ensuring that our taxonomic infrastructures accommodate those more traditional knowledge that you see in smallholder farms in places like India with nomenclature that is not currently as well accommodated by these global infrastructures. And so again, RDA has engaged a bit with the Biodiversity Information Standards community, but not yet in the context of agriculture. And so there's absolutely opportunity for our community of practice to ensure that we are mutually informed, not just on the use cases for our infrastructure, but on the content of the standards that we use, and also on the usability of those infrastructures. So there's a lot of cross-pollination we can support. The last example, yes. I'm sorry?
No, just if you could wrap up, please. Thank you.
Sure. I'm just about done.
Thanks.
So the last example is the Brazilian example of implementation of the FAIR principles through GoFair. And this is an example where our Brazilian colleagues draw from the experience through EGAD and participation in RDA to implement things for Brazil. And we expect there to be many more examples such as this. So to wrap up, what we're actually proposing here is essentially a mechanism to be a convener that brings together many regional networks into a global community of practice to increase awareness, to get that input from regional organizations for use cases, to ensure that traditional knowledge is included as we discuss our solutions, as we protect farmer and other data rights, and to ensure that we can provide linkage with other domain expertise through RDA. So the next steps for us are to submit our community of practice statement for RDA approval. We will have two opportunities in the next RDA plenary. One is a session specific to EGAD, but we will also be participating in a session about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Registration is already open for RDA, so I encourage you to look at that. And then we will be organizing a virtual meeting week in May that will have times conducive to participation throughout the world. And there we will discuss the roadmap and the principles for our new community of practice. So with that, I'll say thank you. And I believe several of my co-authors are here to help answer questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cynthia.